I'm Dr. Tasia White, and you're listening to Things My Boss Never Told Me. Hello, and welcome to episode number 8 of Things My Boss Never Told Me. I am your gracious host, Dr. Tasia White, and I am excited for us to continue our conversation on team essentials. So, if you can remember from episode number 7, I started this conversation on identifying 6 key components to establishing a cohesive team dynamic. And in the first half, we talked about establishing boundaries, setting expectations, and developing mutual accountability. And in this episode, we are going to be focusing on the 3 remaining components, which are collaboration, balance, and compassion. Now, before we jump into today's conversation, let's just quickly recap what was previously discussed in episode number 7. So we started by identifying what a team is. And I gave the description that a team is essentially a group of people working towards a common goal. So although much of the conversation has been focused on work teams or teams in professional settings, I think much of what has been discussed and will continue to be discussed in this episode can apply to really any kind of team dynamic, whether it's in a sports setting or in a professional environment or just any other type of environment that has teams. These components can really help to shape the team and move it in a positive direction, especially if they have the right facilitator. And that's essentially what the role of the supervisor of the team is. They are the ones who would be facilitating these components. And I started the conversation by talking about setting boundaries and the significance of having boundaries. And I mentioned the activity that I did with my own team where we established our red flags, green flags, and yellow flags. Next, I talked about setting expectations, which is more of a formal representation of how the team is expected to operate. And ideally, as a supervisor, we're the ones establishing those expectations in advance and then giving the teams an opportunity to review and possibly provide some feedback to contribute to said expectations, assuming that they are appropriate for the work environment. And I talked about fair process and how that's a great tool for having a constructive conversation, whether it be establishing something new or needing to make any kind of change. Fair process provides a really great framework for having these challenging conversations with our teams in the way that can help move the needle along, so to speak. And then we wrapped up by talking about mutual accountability and how mutual accountability builds over time, partially because of what takes place in those first 2 components. But also, as the teams are working together, they become more comfortable with holding each other accountable because they understand what their responsibilities are and how it all contributes to the team as a whole. And I talked about the grippy model and how that provides a great framework for making sure that the different areas within a work environment or team are discussed and understood by each member of the team so that everyone is on the same page going forward. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and jump into our 3 remaining components. So you may recall in episode number 7, I categorized these first 3 as establishing a basis of understanding, which is something that I talked about in previous episodes in terms of making sure that everyone is on the same page, right? And I think that really sums up those first 3 components. However, with the 3 remaining components, it's really focused more on the ongoing facilitation that takes place and how important it is for a supervisor to keep these components in mind to sustain the team dynamic as they go forward. So with collaboration, that seems obvious, right? Obviously, we want our teams to be collaborative. We want them to work together. However, one of the things that is often missed by supervisors is understanding how to really establish that collaborative mindset. There are some people who believe that by just putting these individuals together, they will automatically collaborate. And while that's partially true, what can be overlooked sometimes is understanding that collaborative teams are not a group of people who individually work on something and bring them together to make it a whole. That may be true in a team setting, right? A typical team setting. However, collaboration, like true collaboration, the members are working together. And while everyone has their own skills that they are bringing to the team dynamic, it's still working together to solve the problem. Not saying, okay, you take A, you take B, and you take C. It's saying we're all in this together, so we're all going to work on A, and then B, and then C. And I think a really good example of this that I actually facilitated in one of my trainings with my RAs was having them do this word scramble. And it was actually in a presentation that I did called Working Towards the Collective. And I was highlighting the significance of working groups versus teams. So what I had them do was divide into 4 sub-teams. And then I handed each of them a pile of letters. And then I told them to figure out what the word was. And I intentionally took certain letters from their pile and put it in one of the other piles. And the idea was that as they slowly started to figure out what the word was that they were unscrambling, they recognized that maybe we're missing some letters, and it would force them to go look at the letters that the other teams had to see if they had the missing ones. And then essentially they understood that they should have been working together all along to solve the word scramble, as opposed to Team A having their own Team B and Team C. And that's essentially what having a collaborative team is recognizing that you can't really work in a silo and then bring everything together. It's really about working together from the beginning. And there are a few specific characteristics that I think really highlights the differences between a traditional team and a collaborative team that I've partially gotten from a Harvard Business Review article called The Discipline of Teams, and I will make sure to include a link to that article on my website. And the other part comes from just my own experience working with teams. And it really boils down to just 3 specific characteristics. First, shared leadership roles. Second, having an environment where it is encouraged to have open-ended discussion and problem solving that takes place within a meeting setting. And then third, individual and mutual accountability. Now, with the accountability piece, we've already discussed that at length. And so at this point, I'm sure you understand the importance of accountability, especially having team accountability. So we'll just focus the conversation around the first 2 points, which are shared leadership and creating a space that is conducive to sharing ideas. One of the things that I think is really crucial for a supervisor to keep in mind with the first characteristic that I mentioned is understanding that there should be shared leadership roles. Now, for some leaders, that may be a little hard to swallow, right? Because you think that as a leader, like you should always be the one in charge. However, what I have found is that in those moments when I took a step back and just became a team member, it helped the individual who was maybe overseeing that particular project to step up and share some ideas and things, but it also gave them a sense of empowerment. And I think that's really crucial. So going back to what I shared in episode number 2, like my role is to build other leaders. So ideally creating this opportunity where they can lead and I take a step back as the leader helps to build their leadership skills as they go on. And this was something that I practice very frequently within my team. And so specifically with my professional staff members, we had 3 major projects that took place within our department annually. And I assigned each of my team members one of those projects. So just to give you a little bit of backstory, my predecessor had this process where they would always be the one to lead these projects, and everyone within the department had a hand in executing the various tasks. And while that's okay, I saw an opportunity to do things a little bit differently. And my spin on it was to assign it to one of my team members to be the lead. And then we all worked together on it from that standpoint. So I wasn't necessarily leading the project every single time. I was giving them the authorship to do it. And I was stepping in as the role of team member. And this is something that I enjoyed doing for a couple of reasons. So one, it kind of took a little bit of the pressure off of me to execute these specific projects because I had other things on my plate and was trying to juggle a lot already. So it was nice to know that someone else was taking the lead and I was essentially being tasked with certain things that I was able to just do quickly and focus my attention on the overall departmental aspects. Two, again, it gave my team an opportunity to really shine and show off their leadership skills as well as their own perspective, and allowed for them to be a little bit more open about how they see things. Now, I was always there as a resource, but ultimately I left it up to them to decide the best way to execute the particular project. And then three, the result would typically be something new and innovative that I didn't imagine or that we hadn't done before. So ultimately, taking a step back was a win-win for everyone and really benefited the department overall, which is what we should be striving for, right? Now, I will admit, doing something like this does require a certain level of trust within your team, right? And my stance was, well, clearly I hired these individuals for a reason, and the people who I didn't hire, who remained in the department, were there for a reason. So I needed to trust in their ability to get things done. But I also made sure that I remained in communication with them. And so during our one-on-one sessions, I would use it as an opportunity just to check in, make sure that they didn't miss anything, making sure that they didn't have any questions or concerns, and just seeing how I could be a resource for them. And that was a great opportunity for me to stay abreast of where the process was and to give insight whenever I felt it was needed. And not everyone needed guidance, but at least that was an option for them. So that when we met as a team, I still maintained my role as team member. And it wasn't as if I was stepping on their shoes within the larger team. We had those conversations beforehand or in private so that they could work on those things and have something to present to the overall team. So in the end, I guess there's still some leading happening, but it's more in the background. And so I guess one of the underlining benefits to doing this is building that sense of trust with my team members, helping them to understand that I have faith in their capabilities and I want them to do their job well. And I'm there to help them along the way, but ultimately it's up to them to execute it. And so I'm not going to hold their hand. I'm not going to micromanage. I'm really just going to take a step back and watch from a distance and see how things unfold and understand that doing this is for their benefit overall, because I want them to have confidence in themselves, to build that trust within themselves, which can then be beneficial to them when they take on future roles. And then because of the trust that is built, the team members will feel more comfortable sharing their ideas, sharing their perspectives, and feeling like they can do so in a safe space and feeling like it's being invited versus being nervous about sharing with the overall team. Which brings us to the second characteristic for establishing collaborative teams. And so with the second characteristic, it's pretty easy, right? Because we've already talked about establishing the trust. And I think another tool that is helpful with facilitating this type of environment is fair process. Understanding that this is a safe space to share ideas, even though you may not necessarily use it for that intention, it still at least gives your team members an understanding that they do have a voice, they can share their perspective, even if it's the opposite of what the leader may think, even if others may disagree with it, there's still a safe space for them to share their ideas and opinions with the overall team. And sometimes team members can feed off of each other. So let's say if one person starts with the idea, another person may have the second part of that idea. And so there is this synergy that starts to formulate because of this open communal space for sharing ideas, which I think ultimately sums up what it is that we're trying to establish with collaborative teams. We want them to have that synergy so that things are done efficiently and creatively. And, it takes a little bit of pressure off of us as leaders to get the work done. It's more of a shared responsibility within the department or within the group that you're operating with. And so no one has too much or too little. Everyone has their hand in the pot and we're all getting the same amount. And I guess I should emphasize that with this approach, the focus is really on the quality and not the quantity. And what I mean by that is with quantity, I think of it as like trying to get multiple things done within a certain period of time. Whereas quality is about getting it done right the first time so you don't have to keep picking at it or going back at it or reviewing it. It's really about putting your best foot forward once so that you don't have to repeat the cycle or repeat the process multiple times. For traditional kind of teams, their objective is the quantity, whereas for collaborative teams, the focus is more on the quality. And so I guess that's the significant difference between the two in terms of the outcome. So just to recap, collaboration being the fourth component of 6 is conducive to establishing a healthy team environment because it emphasizes the significance of building trust through shared leadership responsibilities, through creating safe spaces for sharing one's ideas, and ultimately contributes to the establishment of individual and mutual accountability within the team. Okay, so the 5th component is balance. And I'm specifically referring to the balance of ideas, strengths, and weaknesses, because ideally, we should be looking to have a team that complements each other, that promotes diversity of ideas, so that as a whole, we're able to look at things from all perspectives. As I mentioned previously, the last thing we want to have is groupthink within a team dynamic, because having a team where everyone approaches things the exact same way and everyone thinks the same way can really stunt our growth as a team. And so I felt like balance was a significant component to highlight, because balance is what helps to keep the team moving forward, and not just in the sense of doing the work, but doing the work in a way that is innovative, that helps to grow the department or grow the business. Because if we keep approaching problems the same way every single time, we're going to get the same results every single time. One of my favorite quotes, and I'm not exactly sure where this stems from, is, if you do what you've always done, you'll get what you've always got. So if we are looking for different results, we have to make sure that we have people around us who can produce the different results through their unique perspective that they are contributing to the collective. And so the best way to approach this is to make sure that we are surrounding ourselves with individuals who are different from us, who have strengths in areas that we don't have strengths, and who maybe have weaknesses in areas that we have strengths. And working together to complement each other and ultimately balance each other out overall. And this was a discovery that I made about the time that I started to oversee my own department, because I realized that in order to keep our department moving like a well-oiled machine, I had to make sure that we were all working together harmoniously. So the things that I wasn't good at, my associate director was good at. And the stuff that we couldn't necessarily work on, we were able to have our area coordinators work on them so that everyone had a significant role, everyone understood how it all fit the overall dynamic of the department, and it just made things move a little bit more smoothly. And this sort of hits on a couple of themes that we've already discussed. So, one, in order to get to this harmonious place, we have to have an idea of our strengths and weaknesses as well as the strengths and weaknesses of our teams. We have to know what everyone's role is and understand what the overall goal is and how we should best interact with each other. We've established trust and mutual accountability. And so when you combine all of those things, which does take time and effort, right? I started episode number 7 recognizing that there is going to be effort on the part of the leader to facilitate this. And so in order to get to a point where the team is balanced, where everyone is complementing each other, all of these other pieces have to take place first. And what I've found is by investing that time in the beginning, when you're first forming the team, saves a significant amount of time and effort later on, but also helps you to start to formulate this dynamic that is collaborative, that does complement each other. It's something that you can start to ignite at the beginning and watch it flourish over time. And the same can be true when you are taking on a new team. Granted, it's going to take a little bit more time and effort, especially if the team has been working together for a long time. But ultimately, any kind of reset, whether it's you stepping in as the leader or you acquiring new team members, that is the perfect opportunity to implement the concepts that I'm sharing with you now. Starting with setting boundaries and expectations and developing mutual accountability and so forth. And I would just add that from an individual standpoint, what's happening for our team members is what we talked about in episode number 3 related to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. They are being fulfilled because they're feeling connection to the department. They feel that sense of belonging, which is, pretty high up on the pyramid, and transitioning upward towards self-actualization. And so taking this approach has so many benefits, not only for the department, but also for the individuals who are contributing to the department. And before I continue, I do want to take a moment to acknowledge that when it is a situation where you're coming in to a team that has already been established, like if you're the new addition, that will be significantly more work on your part versus if you're coming in and maybe there is part of a team and you need to hire people to add to the team, or if you're completely starting over and establishing a team. In those two examples, it is much easier to implement the concepts that I'm sharing with you. However, when it is a situation where the team has already been established, understand that there may be a lot of undoing that needs to take place first related to whatever your predecessor did or how your predecessor approached things. And I think the best way to approach that is to still go through the process of establishing boundaries and expectations. But when it comes to fair process, like really taking the time to listen and understand why things were done a particular way. Not just listening to understand how you can change it, like really taking the time to listen to understand. One of the analogies that a former colleague of mine used is that particularly if you're starting a new job, and you're new to that environment, those first few months, you're just trying to find all the parking lots. You're just trying to get a sense for what the culture is within the department, within the company, and try to understand like where you can best fit in, but also getting a sense for where there may be some opportunities for change. So when I think about my own experience with this, I'm reminded of when I started to oversee my first department. It was a situation where I would be acquiring two individuals who were already working for the department, and I was hiring two new members. And even in that case, like I did make sure that those first few months, I listened more than I shared, particularly around like processes and policies and things like that. And I think that made a significant difference in terms of establishing trust with those who were already within the department. Whereas for the new folks, they didn't know any better. So they just kind of followed suit with me. But I wanted to make sure that for the individuals that I was adapting, for lack of a better word, I invested the time to understand first, develop some interpersonal credibility, which we've talked about before, and then inserted what I felt would be most appropriate for our department because of the direction that I was moving it towards. Now, I've also been in a situation where the team had already been established and I was the new person coming in, and it was really challenging. There's no sugarcoating it. Like, it was really, really challenging for me coming in as the new person who didn't really have a lot of knowledge in that particular area. And so it required me to spend a little extra time listening to try to understand before making any changes. So I guess the biggest loss in the second scenario was time. So when I think about the three different opportunities that may be presented. So 1, starting a completely new team. 2, kind of blending a team, and then 3, adopting an already established team. I would say that with the brand new team, I saw this collaborative kind of dynamic within the first month or 2. And with the blended team, I saw things getting to that point in month 3 or 4. Whereas the team that I adopted, that took more like 6 months to get us to a point where I could see the collaborative synergy start to build. And then unfortunately, some other circumstances came into play. And so I never got to fully see that come to fruition. But it's just interesting for me to see the differences establishing that collaborative team dynamic. Okay, so let's recap. So in terms of balance, the key thing is to have diversity in ideas and strengths and weaknesses and perspectives so that you have a team that can complement each other, which can assist in creating a synergistic energy that really helps to push the department or the business forward. Because you have individuals bringing different perspectives and you're able to approach things from multiple angles. And so ideally, we want to have people on our teams who have skills in areas that maybe I'm not familiar with, or who can help offset my weaknesses. So for example, with me being a high-level thinker, I need to make sure that I have someone who is more detail-oriented on my team so that nothing gets missed. Okay. All right. So now we will transition to our 6th and final component for establishing a cohesive team dynamic. And I intentionally saved this one for last because it's very different from the other components that we've discussed. And it also sort of switches gears in terms of what the role of the leader is as the facilitator of this team dynamic. So before we talk about compassion, I want to take a moment to revisit some of the topics that were discussed in episode number 4, where we talked about mindful leadership, because much of what was discussed in that episode will be reminiscent of what will be discussed today as it relates to compassion. And so the 2 things I want us to keep in mind are, One, emotional intelligence and the significance of developing that skill as leaders. And two, understanding that leaders have to model the behaviors that they want to see in their team members. And so those two specific concepts that we discussed in the mindfulness episode will sort of be revisited today as we talk about compassion. So when I think about compassion, I'm reminded of a book that I read when I was in undergrad, and it was specifically for my interpersonal communications class. And that was just a very eye-opening class for me for many, many reasons. But this book in particular stood out to me because it introduced a different set of qualities that leaders should possess. And at that time, I didn't have a lot of knowledge about the different types of leadership. I would say much of what I know about leadership today came from, one, the experiences I had after college, and two, what I was reading in graduate school. And so this book was sort of like my first introduction to learning about leadership in a more formal capacity. And I guess the reason why I was so drawn to this book was the fact that I felt like it really spoke to more of who I was as a person and not so much as a leader. Because at that time, I was a student leader, but not in the sense that I was supervising people. It was more so guiding people through my role as an RA, as well as an executive board member of different clubs and organizations. So it was a very different type of leadership. And so the book that we were reading from my interpersonal communications class was called Leading with Soul by Lee Bowman and Terrence Steele. And what I drew from this book were these 4 specific qualities that were recommended for leaders, especially those who are looking to have some kind of spiritual connection to their work. And those 4 qualities are authorship, love, power, and significance. Now, based on what we've discussed thus far between episode 7 and this one, authorship, power, and significance should not be a surprise, right? Because I've kind of interwoven those different themes into the 5 components that were previously discussed. However, the part that's new is around the concept of love. And so my version of that is compassion. Having compassion for those that we're leading. And by doing so, we're getting that in return. And so one of the ways that I would foster compassion within my teams was helping them to understand that we were part of a family. We were all part of the Res Life family, which is essentially short for residential life or residence life. But we had this understanding that within family, there may be some things that we disagree with, but at the end of the day, we know that we care about each other. We care about each other's well-being and each other's success. So at the end of the day, when we have those disagreements, understanding that it's not coming from a place of malice. At least that was what I was intentional about promoting. And also with family, recognizing that sometimes we have to look out for each other. So if someone's having a bad day, or if someone seems to be falling behind on a particular project, let's all make sure that we're pitching in to help each other. So if someone notices that I'm having a bad day, they may come and check in with me and just say, hey, how are things going? Or if I notice that one of my staff members wasn't quite meeting my expectations on a particular timeline, just checking in with them to say, hey, what's going on? How can I help? And ultimately creating this atmosphere that helped my team feel like that they were more than just my employees. They were people that I actually cared about. And so why did I do this? Well, I think it goes back to episode 3 and 4. With episode 3, recognizing that having that sense of connection and belonging and self-actualization, going back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, like that makes a significant difference in one's desire to go to work every day and to continue working at that particular place or continuing to work with that particular boss. I go back to that article I shared with you about, people don't leave jobs, they leave their bosses. And that's not something I wanted any of my team members to experience. I wanted them to feel like I cared about their overall success and well-being. And then in terms of episode number 4, I talked about just being mindful and recognizing that when I model this behavior of having compassion, of being more of a family, then my team members would do the same. And so I recognize the significance of compassion on multiple levels. And so I'm sure you may be wondering, so how did you foster compassion? Well, I would say there were probably 3 specific things that I did. The first one being just establishing this culture of being a family. And so it's something that I talked about on my very first day. It's something I talked about individually with my staff members, what I talked about in a large group setting, whether it was with my professional staff or my entire staff of 50 plus people. Family was reiterated on multiple occasions. And so in every training, we talked about us being a Res Life family. In our manuals, there was reference to us being a family. And so just being consistent in terms of my messaging of us treating each other like a family and drawing upon that when there were moments when things weren't going well or when there were disagreements, and recognizing that at the end of the day, we are a family. And so we need to make sure that we forgive and ultimately work together cohesively. And so the second thing that I did is something that I probably did not do a good job of early in my leadership career, but it's definitely something that has become second nature. And it's using we language, speaking from the perspective of us and we versus me and I or you. And what I found is that by using that kind of language, it kind of removes some of the anxiety or frustration that may come up in situations, especially if it's a situation where there's some kind of confrontation. So let's say, going back to the previous example with my employee not keeping up with my expected timeline on a project, asking them, what can we do to fix this? Or how can we work together? And including myself in we. And I know I referenced this in an earlier episode, but I really feel like this is one of the components that really helps to develop that culture of compassion. And so no one feels like they're being accused of anything, or no one feels like they have to do it alone. It's really understanding that we are working together, working towards a common goal. And if you think about it, language does matter, right? What we say to each other, how we say it, makes a significant difference. So the fact that I intentionally use we language is acknowledging that by speaking in that context, we're building camaraderie and connection. And so I share all of that to say, don't underestimate language, especially the use of we language and how it contributes to establishing compassion as a team culture. And then the third thing that I found to be helpful in terms of fostering compassion is just being vulnerable. I know for some people that may be uncomfortable, right? Especially if you're in a leadership position. However, I have found that when you are vulnerable, especially with your teams, one, it makes you more human in their eyes. And so if you think about when we're young and we see our teachers like in the supermarket, it's like, whoa, you go to the supermarket? The same thing applies. Like, wow, like you make mistakes, or wow, like you have trouble with this thing too. And it goes back to what was previously mentioned about establishing trust. Like if they see that you're able to be vulnerable, then they will do it in return. And I'm one who believes that vulnerability is something that you just do, or something that you just are. It's not something that you should practice or something that should be orchestrated in any way. Like it needs to be authentic. It needs to come from a real place. And so for some people, the idea of being vulnerable may be uncomfortable, and that's totally okay. I know for me, in the times that I have been vulnerable with my teams, I've found it to be very comforting in terms of the response that I receive from them. And so one good example is back when I took on my first job in higher education. And full disclosure, this was a job that I was really excited about when I first started. However, because of some environmental dynamics, I was slowly discovering that maybe that wasn't the best environment for me. And my supervisor at the time agreed. And so she decided that she was not going to renew my contract. And she was like, it's not that we don't think that you did a good job. It's just that we don't think that this is a good fit for us. And, I was obviously upset by that because this was the first time I'd ever experienced anything like that, fresh out of college. So it definitely was something that I was having a hard time processing. But one of the things that really bothered me about her reasons for not continuing my contract was the fact that she felt I was showing favoritism towards certain staff members. And I was shocked by that because I'm not one to demonstrate any kind of favoritism. If anything, my intention has always been to develop individual interpersonal relationships with my team members. And so I focus more on the quality of that relationship, not so much on how frequent we're connecting. And so from her perspective, she felt like I was showing favoritism towards certain individuals. And when I announced to my team that I would not be returning the next year, and I'd shared with them the feedback that I received about showing favoritism, and I used that as an opportunity to apologize to them because I never thought I was showing favoritism. And so I was just like, I'm really sorry if any of you ever felt like I wasn't giving you my attention or if I liked other people because of whatever reasons, that was never my intention. And they all looked at me like I was crazy. And they were like, no, we don't think that you show favoritism. It's like you treat us all very differently and we all have our different skill sets. And so you know who to go to for different things. And so, no, we don't feel like you're showing favoritism. We feel like you're helping all of us by pulling on our strengths. And that was a really touching moment for me. My intentions were being affirmed at that moment. And that was over 10 years ago. And I still go back to that story because of how impactful it was for me and recognizing that I had reached that point of establishing compassion. And I don't think we could have gotten to that point if I wasn't vulnerable, if I wasn't sharing with them what was really happening behind the scenes and letting them know that, I was in a tough space. So I share all of that to say, compassion is something that should not be overlooked as a component for establishing a cohesive team dynamic. Again, it's something that we may not necessarily consider because it's not something that is traditionally talked about in leadership texts. But from my own experience, as well as from what I've read in very select articles and things, compassion does go a long way. And that essentially wraps up our 6 components. So just to recap, in episode 7, we talked about boundaries, expectations, and accountability. And then here in episode number 8, we talked about balance, making sure our teams complement each other in terms of strengths and weaknesses, collaboration, really working together as a team to solve problems, to work on projects, and giving others an opportunity to take the lead on those projects, and compassion, which involves establishing a culture of family, the use of we language, and demonstrating vulnerability as a leader. And that's it. I know a lot of information has been thrown at you in these 2 episodes, and so I hope that you've been able to keep up, but understand that these are things that I have found to really work. And there is plenty of literature that talks about these different components in various ways, but they're all kind of separate. And so what my intention was with these 2 episodes was bringing it all together and helping all of you understand how they can all fit together. And so as always, I hope that you got something useful out of these 2 episodes. Okay? And so with that said, we will transition to this episode's gratitude list. So first, I would like to thank my professor who later became my colleague, Grace, for introducing me to the book, Leading with Soul. In preparing for this episode, I realized how much of an impact that specific book has on my personal leadership style. And so If it wasn't for Grace introducing that book to us in her class, who knows what my leadership style would be like today. So thank you, Grace. Next, I am grateful for the leaders that I know who have led with soul. Now, granted, it may not have been exactly how the book outlined it, but there are plenty of individuals who I feel like did some form of that in their own style. And so, for example, one of my previous supervisors, Mark, who opened up his home and really made us feel like family, he's someone that I found to be very influential in terms of establishing that family-like dynamic, seeing it on a larger scale, bringing an entire department together. So it's because of people like him who have reflected to me a different style of leadership that actually matches my own preference. And then last but not least, I'm grateful for all of you just being open to the ideas that I've shared in these 2 episodes, especially the ones I shared in this specific episode, because it is a little unconventional. It is a little different than maybe we might see in literature, in how other people describe their style. But I at least hope that you were able to get a glimpse into how significant these qualities are in terms of establishing a cohesive team, and that you are able to find your own way of adopting the things that I have shared in these 2 episodes. So thank you all for your openness. All right, and so now we will go to this episode's affirmation. I am a resilient leader who isn't afraid to be vulnerable with my teams. So given that we kind of ended on the note of vulnerability, I kind of felt called to focus on vulnerability for this episode's affirmation, because I think it's something that is really underrated. I mean, granted, now we have some books and things about vulnerability. I think about like Brene Brown's book, The Power of Vulnerability. And while we're seeing that in spaces like mental health, I think vulnerability certainly has a home in leadership, because leadership is about people. It's about influencing people and making a significant difference. And so why wouldn't we include vulnerability into the equation? Anyway, I hope that you can understand where I'm coming from with all of this. All right, so that wraps up this episode. For episode number 9, we're going to talk a little bit more about teams, but in a very different way than we have these past 2 episodes. So just get ready. It's going to be a little bit more fun. It's going to be a little bit more light, and I hope that you enjoy it. Okay? So thank you so much for listening, and have a great day. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Things My Boss Never Told Me. Before you go, please make sure that you like and subscribe down below. Also, I included a few recommended videos for you to check out. Thank me later.